Hello and welcome to the Snooze Chronicles, where history whispers its hidden stories, and we uncover the untold truths that often lie beneath the surface. Tonight, we're drifting back in time to explore one of the darkest chapters of ancient Egypt, the grim reality of slavery in an ancient civilization. So, settle in, relax, and let's journey together into a forgotten past. If you think you know what slavery looked like in Egypt, think again. Forget everything Hollywood has shown you. Forget the sanitized textbook versions that skip over the blood, the screams, and the unimaginable suffering. What we're about to explore together will shatter those comfortable illusions and reveal the raw, unvarnished truth about what it meant to be human property in the land of the pharaohs. For over 3,000 years, the mighty Egyptian empire was built on the broken backs of countless enslaved human beings. These weren't just nameless statistics in history books. They were real people with real names, real families, real dreams that were crushed under the weight of absolute power and systematic brutality. Today, you're going to meet one of them. His name was Nefer, and his story represents the experiences of millions who suffered and died to build the monuments we still marvel at today. Through his eyes, we'll witness the capture, the sale, the daily torment, and the ultimate erasure of a human life that the pharaohs considered worth less than the stone blocks their slaves carried. This isn't entertainment. This isn't a dramatic retelling for shock value. This is the truth that powerful people throughout history have tried to bury, sanitize, or justify. But the archaeological evidence doesn't lie. The ancient records don't lie. And the bones of the enslaved, when we find them, tell stories that demand to be heard. Before we begin this journey together, I want you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This channel is dedicated to uncovering historical truths that make us uncomfortable, truths that challenge our assumptions about the past and help us understand how power and oppression have shaped human civilization. Your support helps us continue this important work. Leave a comment below and tell me, what do you think you know about slavery in ancient Egypt? Have you been taught the sanitized version, or have you already encountered the brutal reality we're about to explore? I read every comment, and your perspectives help shape future videos. Now, let's step back in time to a world where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, where children were torn from their families and branded like cattle, where entire populations lived and died for the glory of god kings who saw them as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. This is the story they didn't want you to hear. This is the horrific life of an Egyptian slave. The Pharaoh's Machine: How Slavery Fueled Egypt. To understand the true horror of slavery in ancient Egypt, we first need to understand the machine that created and sustained it. This wasn't some chaotic, disorganized system of oppression. This was a carefully constructed, religiously justified, state-sponsored apparatus of human exploitation that operated with ruthless efficiency for millennia. At the very top of this pyramid of suffering sat the pharaoh, not just a king but a living god whose divine right included absolute ownership of every human being within his realm. The pharaoh wasn't merely tolerating slavery or benefiting from it passively. He was the chief architect, the primary beneficiary, and the ultimate enforcer of a system designed to extract maximum value from human misery. Ancient Egyptian texts don't hide this reality. They celebrate it. Pharaoh Amenhotep II bragged in his victory inscriptions about capturing 89,600 prisoners in a single campaign in the Levant. These weren't prisoners of war who would be ransomed or eventually freed. These were human beings who had just become property of the Egyptian state, destined for lives of brutal servitude. The inscriptions describe these captives with the same language used for livestock inventories. Men capable of heavy labor, women for domestic and agricultural work, children young enough to be trained and broken into absolute obedience. The pharaoh's scribes cataloged them like cattle, noting their ages, physical condition, and projected usefulness. But the pharaoh didn't keep all these slaves for himself. The Egyptian slave system operated like a vast distribution network, with the divine ruler at the center dispensing human property to maintain the loyalty and power of his supporters. Temples received thousands of slaves to work their vast agricultural estates and maintain their complex religious operations. High-ranking nobles were granted slaves as rewards for military service or administrative competence. Even mid-level officials might own a few dozen human beings to work their properties and serve their households. This wasn't random or chaotic. It was systematic. The pharaoh used slave distribution to create and maintain a hierarchy of complicity that made the entire Egyptian upper class dependent on the continuation of slavery. If you were a temple priest benefiting from the labor of 500 enslaved people, you had a vested interest in supporting Pharaoh's slave-raiding campaigns. If you were a noble whose wealth came from the work of enslaved agricultural laborers, you became an active participant in maintaining the system. The religious establishment played a crucial role in justifying this horror. Egyptian theology positioned the pharaoh as the earthly embodiment of divine order, and slavery was presented as part of the natural, God-ordained structure of the universe. Enslaved people weren't just politically powerless, they were spiritually diminished, considered closer to animals than to the free Egyptian population. Ancient Egyptian texts describe slaves using dehumanizing language that makes their status crystal clear. They weren't people who happened to be enslaved, they were property that happened to be human-shaped. The word bak, used for male slaves, originally meant worker, but came to imply complete ownership and disposability. Female slaves were hemet, a term that emphasized their reproductive and domestic utility to their owners. The scale of this system defies easy comprehension. Conservative estimates suggest that at the height of Egyptian power, somewhere between 20 and 30% of the population consisted of enslaved people. In major cities like Thebes and Memphis, the proportion was likely even higher. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of human beings living in conditions of absolute subjugation. Archaeological evidence supports what the written records tell us. Excavations of worker villages near major construction sites reveal stark disparities in living conditions. Free workers lived in multi-room houses with proper drainage, cooking facilities, and storage areas. Enslaved workers were crammed into barrack-style buildings with minimal amenities, barely enough space to lie down, and no privacy or personal possessions. The economic model was brutally simple: capture people for free, work them to death, replace them with fresh captives. It was cheaper to let slaves die from overwork and malnutrition than to maintain them in good health. This wasn't an oversight or unintended consequence. It was deliberate economic calculation. Pharaoh Ramesses II, often celebrated as one of Egypt's greatest rulers, left inscriptions boasting about the tens of thousands of foreign captives he used to build his monuments and cities. His scribes recorded not just the numbers captured, but the specific uses to which these human beings were put: quarry work, construction labor, agricultural production, domestic service, and military support roles. But here's where the story becomes personal, where abstract numbers transform into individual human tragedy. Among those thousands of names in Ramesses II's victory records, among those countless anonymous captives dragged in chains to Egyptian cities, was a 12-year-old Nubian boy whose Egyptian masters would call him Nefer. Nefer's story begins not in Egypt, but in a small village along the Nile's fourth cataract, in the land the Egyptians called Cush. He was born free, the son of a cattle herder, living a simple but dignified life among his family and community. He had a name in his own language, dreams of becoming a warrior like his older brothers, and the innocent expectation that he would grow up, marry, have children, and die among his own people. That innocent expectation would be shattered on a morning when the horizon filled with Egyptian war chariots and the air filled with screams. Nefer's story, captured at 12 years old. Let's step into the life of Nefer on the morning that would destroy everything he had ever known. Picture a 12-year-old boy waking up in his family's small mud-brick home in a Nubian village. The sun is just beginning to rise over the Nile, casting long shadows across the settlement where maybe 200 people have lived in relative peace for generations. Nefer stretches and listens to the familiar sounds of morning, his mother grinding grain, his father checking on the cattle, his younger sister laughing at something their grandmother is telling her. These are the sounds of safety, of belonging, of a life that makes sense. In a few hours, these sounds will be replaced by screaming, by the clash of weapons, by the thundering hooves of Egyptian war horses. But Nefer doesn't know that yet. Imagine him stepping outside his home, breathing the cool morning air, maybe thinking about the fishing he'll do later that day with his brothers. Maybe he's looking forward to a festival that's planned for next week, or thinking about a girl in the village who smiled at him recently. He's 12 years old, on the cusp of becoming a man in his community, filled with the ordinary hopes and concerns of adolescence. The attack comes without warning. Egyptian military commanders had perfected the art of the slave raid, striking fast and hard before communities could organize resistance or flee. The first sign of danger is dust on the horizon, but by the time the villagers see it, it's already too late. Imagine Nefer's confusion as shouts erupt around the village. Armed men are running toward the river. Women are grabbing children and trying to flee toward the desert. His father is shouting something about hiding, about running, but there's nowhere to go. The Egyptians have surrounded the village with military precision born of centuries of practice. The next few minutes would remain burned into Nefer's memory for the rest of his life. The sound of his sister screaming as an Egyptian soldier grabs her. The sight of his father trying to fight back with a farming tool against bronze weapons and military training. The moment when a rope settles around his own neck and yanks him to the ground, the rough hemp burning his skin as he's dragged across the dirt. His grandmother, too old to be valuable as a slave, is killed where she stands. His mother disappears in the chaos, and Nefer will never know whether she escaped, was captured, or died in the village. His father falls with an Egyptian spear in his chest, and the last thing Nefer sees of his home is smoke rising from burning houses and Egyptian soldiers loading captives into wooden cages mounted on ox-drawn carts. The journey to Egypt takes 3 weeks. Imagine Nefer crammed into a wooden cage with 20 other captives, given barely enough water to survive and fed a thin gruel that keeps them alive but leaves them constantly hungry. The older captives try to comfort the children, but what comfort can you offer a 12-year-old boy who has watched his world burn? During the long, jolting journey south toward Thebes, Nefer begins to understand the scale of what has happened to him. This isn't a single raid, but part of a larger military campaign. The Egyptian column includes hundreds of captives from multiple villages, all destined for the slave markets of the pharaoh's capital. Some of the older prisoners tell stories about relatives who were taken in previous raids, people who disappeared into Egypt and were never seen again. By the time they reach Thebes, Nefer has learned his first Egyptian words: stand, kneel, work, shut up. He's learned to recognize the crack of a whip and to move quickly when the Egyptian overseers shout commands. He's also learned that resistance brings immediate, savage punishment. One boy his age tried to escape during a rest stop and was beaten so severely that he couldn't walk for the remainder of the journey. The slave market in Thebes operates like any other market, except the commodities being sold are human beings. Picture Nefer standing naked on a wooden platform while potential buyers examine his muscles, check his teeth, and discuss his likely lifespan like farmers evaluating livestock. Egyptian slave merchants have developed sophisticated methods for assessing human property, checking for diseases, estimating strength and endurance, determining the best uses for each captive. Nefer is young, healthy, and intelligent enough to learn quickly. These qualities make him valuable, but they also mean he'll be pushed harder than older slaves who might break under extreme pressure. A temple overseer named Kenti purchases him for the equivalent of 2 months' wages for a skilled craftsman. Nefer doesn't understand the transaction, but he understands that his life now belongs to someone else completely. The walk from the slave market to the temple complex where he'll spend the rest of his life takes about an hour. Imagine Nefer chained to a line of other new slaves, walking through the greatest city he's ever seen, past monuments and buildings that dwarf anything in his home village. Under different circumstances, he might have been amazed by the grandeur, but now all he can think about is how many people like him died building these magnificent structures. At the temple complex dedicated to Ammon-Ra, Nefer meets the other slaves who will become his new family. There are Nubians like himself, Libyans from the Western Desert, Asiatics from the Levant, and even some Egyptians who were enslaved for debt or as punishment for crimes. The diversity of the slave population reflects the scope of Egyptian imperial ambitions. They enslaved anyone they could capture, regardless of ethnicity or background. The older slaves try to prepare him for what's coming. They teach him the Egyptian words he'll need to understand orders and avoid beatings. They show him how to work efficiently without appearing to slack off, how to become invisible when overseers are looking for someone to punish, how to endure pain without showing weakness that might invite more abuse. But nothing they tell him can really prepare a 12-year-old boy for the reality of absolute powerlessness, for the knowledge that every moment of his existence from now until death will be controlled by people who consider him less valuable than their livestock. As Nefer lies down for his first night as a slave, on a thin mat in a crowded barracks with 40 other human beings, listening to the sounds of crying and praying in a dozen different languages, he's still clinging to the hope that this might somehow be temporary. Maybe his surviving family members will find a way to ransom him. Maybe he'll find an opportunity to escape and make his way home. These hopes will sustain him for a while, but gradually they'll be crushed by the daily reality of slave life in ancient Egypt. The system isn't designed to break slaves quickly and dramatically. It's designed to wear them down slowly, day by day, until they accept their condition not just physically but psychologically. Tomorrow, Nefer will begin learning what it means to be human property in the most powerful empire on earth. What work did slaves do? Now let's examine the daily reality of slave labor that would consume Nefer's life and the lives of hundreds of thousands like him. The romanticized image of Egyptian slavery, if such a thing can exist, usually focuses on pyramid building or domestic service in wealthy households. The truth is far more diverse and universally brutal. Egyptian slaves worked in every sector of the economy, performing the dangerous, backbreaking, and degrading tasks that free Egyptians refused to do. They quarried stone in the blazing desert heat, hauled massive blocks across impossible distances, worked in gold mines where life expectancy was measured in months, and labored in agricultural fields from dawn to dusk under the constant threat of violence. Let's begin with construction work, since this is where many people imagine Egyptian slaves spent their time. The reality was far worse than popular imagination suggests. Forget the Hollywood image of thousands of slaves pulling pyramid blocks up ramps while overseers crack whips. That's actually sanitized compared to the historical reality. Archaeological evidence from construction sites reveals the true conditions. At Deir el-Medina, the village that housed workers building royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, we can clearly distinguish between the living quarters of free workers and enslaved laborers. Free workers lived in well-constructed houses with multiple rooms, proper ventilation, and adequate space for families. Enslaved workers were housed in cramped barracks where 10 to 15 people shared spaces designed for 3 or 4. Medical examination of skeletal remains from worker cemeteries shows stark differences in health and lifespan. Free workers show signs of adequate nutrition and medical care when injured. Slave remains reveal chronic malnutrition, untreated injuries, and evidence of systematic physical abuse. The average lifespan of an enslaved construction worker was probably less than 15 years after beginning heavy labor. Imagine Nefer's daily routine at the temple construction project where he's assigned. He wakes before dawn to the sound of overseer shouts and the crack of whips hurrying the slower workers. There's no time for proper meals. Slaves receive a handful of grain porridge and maybe some dried fish or bread, barely enough calories to sustain heavy physical labor. The work itself is designed to break both body and spirit. Nefer and his fellow slaves haul stone blocks weighing several tons using nothing but ropes, wooden levers, and human muscle. When blocks get stuck or someone moves too slowly, the overseers don't hesitate to use whips, clubs, or worse. The Egyptian overseer system operated on the principle that fear was more effective than incentives for managing slave labor. But construction work, as brutal as it was, wasn't the worst fate awaiting Egyptian slaves. That distinction belongs to the mining operations, particularly the gold mines in the eastern desert and Nubia. These were essentially death sentences disguised as work assignments. Ancient sources describe mining operations with horrifying clarity. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 1st century BCE, wrote about gold mines where slaves worked naked in underground tunnels, their bodies marked by constant beatings, surviving on minimal food and water until they collapsed from exhaustion or died from rock falls and toxic fumes. The work process was designed for maximum extraction of gold with complete disregard for human life. Slaves used iron tools to break gold-bearing rock from tunnel walls, working in spaces so narrow they could barely move. Other slaves carried the broken rock to the surface in baskets, making dozens of trips per day up steep, narrow passages. Women and elderly slaves, considered too weak for the heaviest labor, were assigned to crush the rock with hammers and millstones, breathing toxic dust that destroyed their lungs. The life expectancy in the gold mines was measured in months, not years. Mine supervisors didn't bother learning slaves' names because the turnover was so rapid. When someone collapsed from exhaustion or injury, they were left to die where they fell while other slaves continued working around the body. Agricultural slavery represented a different kind of horror, slower, more sustainable exploitation that could extend suffering over decades. Egyptian agriculture depended heavily on slave labor, particularly during planting and harvest seasons when the work was most intensive. Picture Nefer, now several years older, assigned to work on a temple agricultural estate. He wakes before sunrise every day and works until after sunset, planting, weeding, irrigating, and harvesting crops under the constant supervision of armed overseers. The work is physically demanding but not immediately life-threatening like mining or heavy construction. But agricultural slavery came with its own particular cruelties. Slaves working farms were often deliberately kept on the edge of starvation to prevent them from having energy for rebellion or escape attempts. They were fed just enough to maintain working capacity but never enough to feel satisfied or build physical strength beyond what was needed for farm work. Sexual exploitation was systematic and routine on agricultural estates. Female slaves had no protection against rape by overseers, visiting officials, or male slaves forced to breed like livestock to produce the next generation of human property. Children born to enslaved mothers became property of the estate owner from birth, creating multi-generational cycles of bondage. Domestic slavery in wealthy Egyptian households is often portrayed as the gentler form of bondage, but this image is largely mythical. Household slaves worked longer hours than agricultural laborers, were subject to the arbitrary cruelties of their owners' family members, and had even less privacy or personal autonomy than other enslaved people. Female domestic slaves faced constant sexual exploitation from male household members. They were responsible for every aspect of household maintenance: cooking, cleaning, childcare, textile production, and personal service to their owners. Any mistake, however minor, could result in severe punishment. Any resistance or perceived disrespect could result in sale to mining operations or other worse fates. Male domestic slaves served as personal attendants, guards, and skilled craftsmen. While their living conditions might be marginally better than field slaves, they were subject to their owners' psychological abuse and arbitrary violence. Egyptian law gave slave owners nearly unlimited power over their human property, including the right to kill slaves for disobedience. Let's return to Nefer's experience to understand how this system operated on an individual level. After several years of construction work, he's assigned to serve in the household of a mid-ranking temple official. This might seem like an improvement, but it brings new forms of degradation. Imagine Nefer, now 16 years old, responsible for his master's personal care, bathing him, dressing him, serving his meals, and attending to his every need. He's on call 24 hours a day, sleeping on the floor outside his master's bedroom in case he's needed during the night. He has no personal possessions, no privacy, no control over any aspect of his daily existence. His master views him as a useful object, valuable enough to maintain but completely disposable if he becomes inconvenient. Nefer has learned to read his master's moods, to anticipate his needs, to make himself invisible when the man is angry about something unrelated to household service. One wrong move, one moment of perceived insolence, and he could find himself sold to the gold mines. The psychological impact of this existence cannot be overstated. Slavery wasn't just about physical exploitation, it was about the systematic destruction of human dignity and identity. Slaves were given Egyptian names that replaced their birth names, forced to adopt Egyptian religious practices, and punished for speaking their native languages or maintaining cultural traditions. Archaeological evidence supports these brutal realities. Examination of slave quarters at various sites reveals living conditions barely adequate for survival. No personal possessions, minimal space, poor sanitation, and evidence of chronic malnutrition. Skeletal remains show high rates of injury, disease, and premature death. But perhaps most telling are the things we don't find in slave quarters. No religious objects, no decorative items, no tools or possessions that might indicate personal identity or cultural preservation. The archaeological record reveals people who were systematically stripped of everything that might make them feel human. The Egyptian slave system was designed to be self-perpetuating and internally reinforcing. Slaves who showed any leadership ability or organizational skills were quickly identified and either killed or assigned to isolated work that prevented them from influencing other enslaved people. The constant threat of sale to worse conditions kept most slaves focused on individual survival rather than collective resistance. Yet despite this systematic oppression, resistance did occur, and it's to these desperate acts of rebellion that we turn next. Slave rebellions and escapes. The Egyptian slave system may have been designed to crush resistance, but it couldn't entirely eliminate the human desire for freedom. Throughout Egyptian history, enslaved people found ways to fight back, sabotage their oppressors, and attempt escape, even knowing that failure meant torture and death. Understanding slave resistance in ancient Egypt requires recognizing that most acts of rebellion were small, subtle, and designed to avoid detection. Open revolt was nearly impossible given the military power of the Egyptian state and the careful surveillance of slave populations. But enslaved people found countless ways to resist their oppression while maintaining the appearance of compliance. The most common form of resistance was work slowdown and sabotage. Slaves would deliberately work at reduced pace when overseers weren't watching, break tools accidentally, or perform tasks incorrectly to disrupt production schedules. This form of resistance was particularly effective because it was difficult to prove intentional wrongdoing and punishing slaves too severely for apparent clumsiness or incompetence reduced their value to their owners. Archaeological evidence reveals signs of deliberate sabotage at construction sites. Stone blocks with subtle but structurally damaging flaws that suggest intentional poor workmanship. Tool caches hidden in locations where they would rust and become unusable. Construction errors that required extensive rework and delayed project completion. While these might be explained as accidents or incompetence, the patterns suggest organized resistance efforts. More direct forms of resistance occurred regularly but were usually small-scale and quickly suppressed. Egyptian records document numerous instances of individual slaves attacking overseers, refusing to work despite punishment, or attempting to protect other enslaved people from abuse. These acts of defiance rarely achieved practical success, but they served important psychological functions for slave communities. Let's examine how this resistance played out in Nefer's experience. By his early 20s, he had spent over a decade in bondage and had developed the skills necessary for subtle rebellion. He knew which overseers could be manipulated, which fellow slaves could be trusted, and how to create small spaces of dignity within the crushing system of oppression. Imagine Nefer working on a temple construction project, deliberately selecting stones with hidden flaws that will cause structural problems months later. Or picture him teaching newer slaves how to appear busy while actually resting, how to hide food for later consumption, or how to pass messages between work groups without detection by overseers. These small acts of resistance served multiple purposes. They provided psychological relief from the constant humiliation of bondage, created bonds of solidarity among enslaved people, and occasionally achieved practical benefits like extra food or reduced workloads. More importantly, they helped maintain slaves' sense of themselves as human beings rather than property. But some enslaved people took far greater risks in their resistance efforts. Escape attempts, while usually unsuccessful, occurred regularly enough that Egyptian authorities developed sophisticated systems for tracking and recapturing fugitive slaves. Legal documents from various periods describe rewards for capturing runaway slaves, punishments for people who helped them, and the brutal treatment awaiting those who were recaptured. The geography of Egypt made escape extremely difficult. The Nile Valley was surrounded by hostile deserts that few people could cross without substantial preparation and supplies. Major cities were connected by well-patrolled roads with checkpoints designed to catch fugitives. Egyptian authorities maintained detailed records of slave populations, making it difficult for escaped individuals to blend into free communities. Despite these obstacles, escape attempts continued throughout Egyptian history. Some slaves tried to reach their original homelands, though this required crossing hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. Others attempted to disappear into the anonymous crowds of major Egyptian cities, hoping to pass as free laborers or servants. A few tried to reach Egypt's borders with other nations, though Egyptian diplomatic agreements usually resulted in the return of escaped slaves. The punishments for attempted escape were designed to serve as deterrents to other potentially rebellious slaves. Recaptured fugitives were often branded on their faces or hands to permanently mark them as escape risks. Some were subjected to public torture before execution, with other slaves forced to watch as a warning against similar attempts. But the most psychologically devastating punishment was often the fate of slaves who were suspected of helping escape attempts but couldn't be proven guilty. These individuals might be sold to mining operations or other certain death assignments, not for anything they had actually done, but as a reminder that association with resistance efforts carried deadly consequences. Now let's follow Nefer through his own escape attempt to understand how these dynamics played out on an individual level. After 15 years of bondage, he had reached a psychological breaking point where the risk of death seemed preferable to continued slavery. He had also developed relationships with other slaves who shared his desperation and were willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Picture Nefer, now 27 years old, planning his escape with 3 other enslaved men from his work crew. They've been accumulating small supplies for months: dried food, water containers, simple tools, and rough clothing that might help them blend in with free travelers. They've studied the patrol patterns of their overseers and identified a night when security might be lighter due to a religious festival. The escape plan is simple because elaborate schemes are too likely to be discovered or go wrong. They'll slip away during the night shift change, when there's a brief window of reduced supervision. They'll head north toward the Mediterranean, hoping to reach Phoenician trading ships that might take them away from Egypt. It's a desperate plan with little chance of success, but desperation has overcome rational calculation. The attempt fails, as most escape attempts did. Egyptian authorities had centuries of experience tracking fugitive slaves, and the escapees are recaptured within 2 days. They're brought back to the temple complex in chains, beaten unconscious, and left in the sun as examples to other slaves who might be considering similar actions. Nefer's punishment goes beyond physical torture. He's sold to a gold mining operation in the eastern desert, a fate that everyone understands to be a slow death sentence. As he's loaded onto a cart with other condemned slaves, he can see the fear in the eyes of enslaved people who had been his friends and fellow workers. The message is clear: this is what happens to slaves who try to claim their freedom. But even the gold mines couldn't entirely crush the spirit of resistance. Enslaved miners found ways to support each other, to share the burden of impossible working conditions, and to maintain their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. They shared food when possible, cared for injured comrades, and sometimes sacrificed their own safety to help others survive a little longer. Large-scale slave revolts were rare in ancient Egypt, but they did occur, particularly during periods when central authority was weakened by political instability or military campaigns. The most significant documented slave rebellion occurred during the reign of Ramesses III, when enslaved workers at several major construction projects coordinated work stoppages and armed resistance. The rebellion was ultimately crushed by Egyptian military forces, but not before causing significant disruption to major royal projects and demonstrating that enslaved people could organize effective resistance when circumstances allowed. The suppression of this revolt was characteristically brutal, with mass executions designed to terrorize the slave population into submission. Religious resistance also played an important role in slave communities. While slaves were forced to participate in Egyptian religious practices, many maintained secret adherence to their original beliefs and developed syncretic religious practices that combined elements from multiple traditions. These underground religious networks served as communication systems for resistance activities and provided psychological support for enslaved people struggling to maintain their identities. Egyptian authorities recognized the danger of slave religious gatherings and worked to prevent or control them, but the spiritual dimension of resistance proved impossible to eliminate entirely. Enslaved people found ways to practice their beliefs, pass down their cultural traditions, and maintain connections to their pre-enslavement identities despite the systematic efforts to erase these connections. The cumulative effect of slave resistance, while never threatening the fundamental structure of Egyptian slavery, did impose real costs on the system. Constant surveillance, frequent replacements of damaged equipment, delays in construction projects, and the need to maintain large security forces all reduced the economic efficiency of slave labor. More importantly, resistance efforts helped maintain the psychological health and human dignity of enslaved people who might otherwise have been completely broken by their circumstances. Even failed escape attempts and minor acts of sabotage served as reminders that enslaved people remained human beings with agency, not just passive property. As we follow Nefer into the final phase of his life, We'll see how decades of bondage and resistance shaped the experience of growing old in slavery, and how the Egyptian system dealt with slaves who were no longer economically productive. The final years of a slave. Let's step into the final chapter of Nefer's life to understand what it meant to grow old as a slave in ancient Egypt. After nearly 20 years of bondage, including 3 years in the gold mines of the eastern desert, Nefer had somehow survived conditions that killed most enslaved people within a decade. His survival wasn't due to mercy from his captors or favorable treatment. It was the result of intelligence, adaptability, and sheer stubborn refusal to die despite circumstances designed to kill him. Picture Nefer at 32 years old, which made him ancient by slave standards. His body bears the accumulated damage of 2 decades of brutal labor, scarred hands from stone cutting, a crooked left arm that was never properly set after breaking in a mining accident, chronic back pain from years of carrying impossible loads, and the premature aging that comes from constant malnutrition and stress. The Egyptian slave system had no concept of retirement or reward for long service. Enslaved people who survived to old age simply moved to different, less physically demanding forms of labor until they became too weak to work at all. For someone like Nefer, this meant transition from heavy construction and mining work to maintenance tasks, cleaning duties, or assisting with younger slaves' training. But age brought new vulnerabilities alongside reduced physical demands. Older slaves were often targeted for abuse by overseers who saw them as expendable and by younger slaves competing for better work assignments or extra food rations. The solidarity that sometimes developed among slave communities could break down under the pressure of survival, turning potential allies against each other. Nefer's final work assignment was in the temple granaries, counting and moving grain shipments that would feed the free Egyptian population while he remained perpetually hungry. The irony wasn't lost on him, spending his final years surrounded by abundance that he could never taste, handling food that could alleviate his chronic hunger but was forbidden to him under penalty of death. The psychological impact of long-term slavery was perhaps even more devastating than the physical damage. Imagine Nefer looking back on 32 years of life and realizing that every single day had been controlled by someone else's will. He had never made a free choice about where to live, what to eat, how to spend his time, or whom to associate with. His entire adult existence had been shaped by the arbitrary decisions of people who considered him property. Yet something in Nefer had refused to be completely broken. He had maintained memories of his childhood in Nubia, of his family, of what freedom had felt like before it was stolen from him. These memories had become both a source of strength and a form of torture, reminding him constantly of what he had lost and would never recover. The temple granary work brought Nefer into contact with younger slaves, many of them recently captured children who reminded him painfully of his own 12-year-old self. He found himself torn between the desire to help these children adapt to slavery and the knowledge that adaptation meant accepting dehumanization as normal and permanent. Sometimes Nefer would quietly teach new slaves the survival skills he had learned, how to avoid attracting negative attention from overseers, which slaves could be trusted and which were informants, how to find small moments of dignity within complete powerlessness. But he also knew that his advice was helping these children accept their enslavement rather than resist it, and this knowledge added another layer of moral complexity to his already unbearable situation. Egyptian society had developed clear expectations about the disposal of slaves who were no longer economically productive. Unlike free Egyptians, who could expect family care in old age and proper burial after death, enslaved people faced abandonment and erasure when they became too weak to work. The process was coldly practical. When slaves became too old, sick, or injured to perform useful labor, they were typically expelled from their work assignments and left to survive however they could. Some begged for scraps around Egyptian cities until they died of exposure or starvation. Others were taken to remote locations and abandoned to die alone. A few might be kept on as minimal maintenance workers if they had specialized knowledge or skills that couldn't be easily replaced. None of these options provided dignity or comfort in final years. The message was clear: slaves had value only as long as they could produce more than they consumed, and once that equation shifted, they became worthless burdens to be discarded as efficiently as possible. Archaeological evidence confirms the brutal reality of slave death and burial practices. Excavations near major Egyptian cities have uncovered mass graves containing hundreds of bodies buried without grave goods, proper mummification, or individual markers. These anonymous burial sites represent the final indignity inflicted on people who had already suffered every other form of dehumanization. The contrast with free Egyptian burial practices couldn't be more stark. Free Egyptians, even those of modest means, received individual graves, basic mummification, and at least simple grave goods to accompany them into the afterlife. The Egyptian religious system promised eternal life for those who could afford proper burial preparation, but this promise explicitly excluded enslaved people. Nefer understood that when his time came, he would simply disappear. No one would remember his name, his story, or his suffering. There would be no grave marker, no funeral ceremony, no family members to mourn his passing. He would die as he had lived for the past 20 years. As anonymous property whose disposal was a minor administrative detail for his owners. But the approaching end of his life also brought unexpected moments of connection and meaning. Working in the granaries, Nefer encountered an elderly Egyptian scribe named Kamwasit who had been assigned to oversee grain distribution records. Unlike most free Egyptians who treated slaves as invisible furniture, Kamwasit occasionally spoke to Nefer as if he were a human being. These brief conversations became the highlights of Nefer's final years. Kamwasit would sometimes ask about Nubian customs or share observations about temple politics. He never questioned the morality of slavery or offered help with escape, but his simple recognition of Nefer's humanity provided a psychological lifeline during the darkest period of his bondage. Through Kamwasit, Nefer learned about changes in the broader world that had occurred during his decades of slavery. New pharaohs had risen and fallen, military campaigns had been fought and won, architectural projects had been completed using the labor of countless people like himself. The great machine of Egyptian civilization had continued operating, consuming human lives as fuel for its monuments and glory. As Nefer's strength began to fail in his mid-30s, he started experiencing moments of profound psychological clarity about his situation. The daily struggle for survival that had occupied all his mental energy for decades began to recede, replaced by a deeper understanding of what had been done to him and millions of others. He realized that his individual suffering was part of a vast system of exploitation that had operated for centuries before his birth and would continue long after his death. The temples, monuments, and cities that defined Egyptian greatness had been built on an ocean of human misery that was deliberately hidden from historical memory. Yet alongside this devastating realization came moments of unexpected peace. Nefer began to find meaning in small acts of kindness toward other enslaved people, in preserving memories of his family and homeland, and in refusing to let his spirit be completely crushed despite everything that had been done to him. The final months of Nefer's life were spent in the temple's storage areas, performing light cleaning duties that accommodated his failing strength. He moved slowly and painfully, but he had learned to find small pleasures even in this diminished existence. The warmth of sunlight streaming through a window, the taste of an occasional piece of fruit that had fallen and been overlooked, the companionship of other aging slaves who understood his experience without need for explanation. When the end came, it was relatively quick. Nefer collapsed one morning while sweeping grain dust from the storage floor, and by evening he was dead. There was no medical attention, no comfort measures, no acknowledgement that a human life was ending. The temple officials simply noted the loss of one worker and made arrangements for the body to be removed. Nefer's body was loaded onto a cart with several other recently deceased slaves and taken to a pit outside the city where such remains were disposed of. There was no ceremony, no prayers, no recognition of the person who had once been a free child playing by the Nile in a Nubian village. His death was recorded, if at all, as a minor administrative detail in temple ledgers that have long since crumbled to dust. But in the broader context of Egyptian slavery, Nefer's story was neither unique nor particularly tragic by the standards of his time. He had actually survived longer than most enslaved people and had experienced moments of human connection that were denied to many others. His death was simply one among hundreds of thousands that occurred during the centuries when Egyptian civilization flourished on the foundation of human bondage. The systematic erasure of slave identities and experiences was one of the most successful aspects of the Egyptian slavery system. By denying enslaved people proper burial, historical record, or cultural memory, Egyptian society ensured that their suffering would remain invisible to future generations. The monuments would endure, but the people who built them would be forgotten. This erasure wasn't accidental or incidental, it was deliberate policy designed to maintain the moral comfort of free Egyptians who benefited from slave labor. If enslaved people were properly remembered as human beings with names, families, and individual stories, it would be much harder to justify the system that destroyed their lives for the convenience of their masters. Archaeological discoveries in recent decades have begun to recover some of this lost history. Mass graves, slave quarters, and work sites provide physical evidence of the scale and brutality of Egyptian slavery. But the individual stories, the personal experiences, the specific human costs of this system remain largely lost to history. Nefer's story, though fictional, represents the experiences of countless real people whose names and stories we will never know. His suffering was multiplied by hundreds of thousands across the centuries of Egyptian imperial power. His strength, dignity, and humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization exemplified the resilience of enslaved people throughout history. As we consider what this history means for our understanding of ancient civilizations, we must grapple with the uncomfortable truth that some of humanity's greatest cultural achievements were built on foundations of systematic oppression and human exploitation. Conclusion and call to action. We've now followed Nefer's journey from a free child in a Nubian village to his anonymous death in an Egyptian temple storehouse. His story, representative of millions of similar experiences, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about one of history's most celebrated civilizations. The Egypt we admire in museums and documentaries was built on systematic human exploitation that operated for over 3,000 years. The pyramids, temples, and monuments that still inspire wonder today were constructed with the blood, sweat, and lives of enslaved people whose stories have been deliberately erased from historical memory. This isn't ancient history without modern relevance. The psychological and social mechanisms that allowed Egyptian society to normalize and perpetuate slavery continue to operate in different forms today. The ability to view certain groups of people as less than fully human, the economic systems that prioritize profit over human welfare, and the cultural narratives that celebrate achievements while ignoring their human costs remain powerful forces in our contemporary world. Understanding the reality of Egyptian slavery also helps us recognize how historical narratives are constructed and maintained. The sanitized version of Egyptian history that most of us learned in school isn't accidental. It reflects conscious choices about which aspects of the past to emphasize, celebrate, or ignore. Egyptian elites worked actively to erase slave experiences from historical record, and modern historians, archaeologists, and educators have often continued this erasure by focusing on monumental architecture and political achievements while minimizing discussion of the human costs of Egyptian greatness. The story of Nefer and millions like him reminds us that historical greatness often comes at prices that are carefully hidden from view. Every civilization that has relied on systematic exploitation has developed sophisticated methods for making that exploitation invisible or justifiable to the people who benefit from it. But what does this mean for how we should think about history, power, and human dignity in our own time? First, it means we need to actively seek out the hidden stories, the suppressed voices, and the uncomfortable truths that powerful people prefer to keep buried. History isn't just what happened to kings and pharaohs, it's what happened to everyone, including the people whose suffering made royal achievements possible. Second, it means we need to be skeptical of historical narratives that seem too clean or inspiring. When we encounter stories of civilizational achievement that don't acknowledge their human costs, we should ask what's being left out and why. The absence of discussion about exploitation doesn't mean exploitation didn't occur. It usually means someone has worked hard to hide it. Third, we need to recognize that the same psychological and social mechanisms that allowed ancient peoples to normalize slavery continue to operate today. The human capacity for moral blindness, for treating some people as disposable, for prioritizing abstract ideals over individual suffering hasn't disappeared with historical progress. Understanding the reality of Egyptian slavery doesn't mean we should dismiss all achievements of ancient civilizations or fall into historical nihilism where nothing has value because everything involves exploitation. Instead, it means we should develop more complex, nuanced understanding of how human societies work and what the true costs of cultural and technological achievement have always been. The enslaved people who built Egyptian monuments were human beings with their own thoughts, feelings, dreams, and dignity. They weren't just anonymous labor units in service of pharaonic glory, they were individuals whose lives mattered as much as the lives of their masters, even though their masters couldn't or wouldn't recognize this truth. Nefer's story represents millions of people who lived and died without recognition, whose suffering enabled achievements they never benefited from, whose humanity was denied but never actually destroyed. These people deserve to be remembered not just as statistics or abstract representations of historical injustice, but as individuals who maintained their dignity and humanity under impossible circumstances. Their resistance, whether dramatic or subtle, their care for each other in the midst of systematic cruelty, their preservation of cultural memory and personal identity despite efforts to erase these things, all represent victories of human spirit over systems designed to crush it completely. What can we learn from their example about how to live with dignity in the face of overwhelming power, systematic injustice, and attempts to dehumanize us? How can their strategies for survival and resistance inform our responses to contemporary forms of exploitation and oppression? These aren't abstract historical questions. They're practical challenges that people around the world face today in different forms. The specific mechanisms of oppression change, but the fundamental dynamics of power, resistance, and human dignity remain remarkably consistent across time and culture. As you think about Nefer's story and what it represents, I want you to consider how these historical patterns might be playing out in your own time and place. Where do you see systematic dehumanization occurring today? Where do you see the sanitization of historical narratives to make exploitation invisible or acceptable? Where do you see people maintaining their dignity and humanity despite systematic attempts to deny both? I also want you to think about how historical memory works as a tool of both oppression and liberation. The erasure of slave experiences from Egyptian historical memory served the interests of people who benefited from slavery. The recovery of these experiences through archaeology and critical historical analysis serves the interests of people committed to human dignity and justice. Every time we tell the story of people like Nefer, we're engaging in a form of historical justice that their original oppressors tried to prevent. We're insisting that their lives and experiences matter, that their suffering was real and significant, and that their humanity deserves recognition even centuries after their deaths. This recognition doesn't undo the harm that was done to them, but it does honor their memory and helps ensure that similar patterns of exploitation are more likely to be recognized and resisted when they emerge in new forms. Before you leave this video, I want you to take a moment to reflect on one specific question. If you had been born into Nefer circumstances, how do you think you would have responded? What would have sustained you through decades of bondage? What forms of resistance or dignity would you have tried to maintain? This isn't a comfortable question, and it doesn't have easy answers. But engaging with it seriously can help develop empathy for people facing systematic oppression today, and it can help us think more clearly about what human dignity means and how it can be preserved under extreme circumstances. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. What aspects of this story surprised you the most? What connections do you see between ancient Egyptian slavery and forms of exploitation that exist today? What questions does this history raise for you about how we remember the past and understand the present? Your engagement with these questions helps create a community of people committed to honest historical understanding and contemporary justice. Every comment, every share, every conversation this video generates helps ensure that stories like Nefer's continue to be told and remembered. If this video has challenged your understanding of ancient history or contemporary issues, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this content with others who might benefit from these perspectives. The algorithm rewards engagement, and your support helps ensure that challenging, important content like this can reach broader audiences. The story of Egyptian slavery isn't over just because the pharaohs are gone. Its patterns and lessons remain relevant as long as human societies continue to struggle with questions of power, dignity, and justice. By understanding what happened to people like Nefer, we better prepare ourselves to recognize and resist similar patterns when they emerge in our own time. Remember, history isn't just about what happened in the past. It's about understanding how human societies work, what they're capable of both in terms of achievement and exploitation, and how ordinary people can maintain their humanity in the face of systematic attempts to deny it. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for a world where no one has to live and die as Nefer did. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Sleep well, knowing that in remembering the past, we can build a more just future. And as always, stay tuned for more on Snooze Chronicles.